I'm so happy to be here with Lucas and John, two of, I think, our most provocative theater makers, although mild-mannered in the extreme in person. And in some ways we're here, the thing that binds the two of them together, not in all of their works, but in the works that are kind of in New York's eye at the moment, is a sort of flirtatious relationship with the truth. For those of you, have people here already seen the piece of Lucas's at Soho Rep? I know, Raphael has. I encourage you to see it. It is a wonderful and strange and extraordinarily sad piece of comedy. And it is also one of the things that is most delightful about it is that it really chimes with things that we know are true. So it takes biography and without turning it particularly strange to us, it manages to make it work in a very fantastical way. And John Collins and ERS have worked with verbatim text in their last 3 projects and are now shooting off in a comet-like trajectory away from the comfortable solar system of American literature to make new pieces, one by Sybil Kempson and also Arguendo. And I wanted to ask him about those 2 pieces, especially made in response to the way that he had been working with literature and the written word before that. So, just so you guys know what I'm after. So first, could you each, in your own way, describe the projects that we're talking about? For you, Disney, and for you, Arguendo. Lucas.
So the premise of the play is sort of that you walk into the theater and Walt Disney comes out and he takes out a screenplay and he reads to you a screenplay he wrote about his last days on Earth. And the story, for the most part, is tracking Walt's attempts to make Epcot, which was originally going to be sort of this utopic city. It was not originally a theme park. The vision of Epcot ended up getting perverted around the time of his death into yet another theme park. But originally he wanted to make a town that people would live in, and it was his sort of idea of the perfect community with its own system of government that he kind of created and his own sort of ideas about property ownership. So that's really what the play is kind of tracking, and I sort of, in several respects, cribbed aspects of the structure of King Lear that kind of hold that story.
Excellent. And Arguendo?
Well, Arguendo, I would say about 80% at least of the text of it is the transcript of a Supreme Court oral argument. And it is, there's a little bit on the beginning of some people being interviewed outside the court after having heard the argument, and a little bit of opinion at the end, and maybe a little bit of dancing as well. But what drew us to...
Is that go-go dancing?
Well, we'll see. I still got about 3 months left to work on it. I'm telling you what I know right now. No, it is the task we gave ourselves was to stage the oral argument, and this is a part of this is a place where the constitutional law and theater overlap a little bit, but it's also it's a bit of a cliche to say that to speak of the overlap between trial law and theater. But maybe there's some truth in that in my own situation, because I've always been interested in the law, and for a while I wanted to be a lawyer. But I discovered Supreme Court oral arguments trying to learn about copyright when we were working on The Great Gatsby. So in fact, it indirectly came to that through this literature stuff. But basically, we're reimagining what oral argument might look like with fewer judges and no rules about where they go. So everything's on wheels, and it's as though we have cameras in the courtroom actually, and you're watching it from lots of different angles. But basically, we rely on the transcript of the oral argument, and it's surprisingly accessible, sometimes surprisingly hilarious, to hear them trying to suss out what exactly is dance, and is this conduct or is this expression? I mean, intellectually, it's a fascinating text, and it's a lot of fun too.
When you both make pieces which are based on things that exist not as dramatic texts, so Lucas, for instance, made a piece, a wonderful, also very whimsical, but also very sad piece called Isaac's Eye, which was at EST recently. And both of those pieces were based in biography. And I know that people who work with true things can often be kind of caught up in the glamour of what's real. And that you have to kind of wean yourself off the excitement of saying, but it's interesting because it's true. And you have to exert the sort of the artist's wit and say, no, but it's got to be interesting on stage as well. And so my question for both of you is, I know that you're kind of in process right now, John, so maybe this will just cause you to break down and start crying at the end. But Lucas,
action up here.
It's very, it's self-performance. But Lucas, for you, if you could kind of compare the experience of working on Isaac's Eye, which was about Isaac Newton, and had a wonderful kind of, imagine, if you know the comedian Dimitri Martin as Isaac Newton, a kind of marvelous, lacquer, hands in his pockets, Isaac Newton, waiting for that apple. And obviously Walt Disney, who's the generational opposite of that, who's looking at it from the end of his creative life. How did you take the raw material of these life stories and kind of rip them apart for your own ends?
Well, I was really influenced very strongly and stole a lot from a Jeffrey M. Jones play called Dirty Little Secrets, which I actually think is one of the greatest unknown plays of the past 20 years. And it's this play where he takes Pamela Anderson and Tommy Lee and Michael Jackson and a whole bunch of celebrities and constructs these short little scenes about them. But really what you're watching these celebrities deal with are just really mundane, ordinary problems. You know, Tommy Lee and Pamela Anderson are having some marriage problems, so they're talking about it. And it takes on this sort of mythic scale because of there are these sort of, maybe it's a stretch to call them iconic figures, but they're sort of bigger than life figures. And I thought there was something really fun and kind of perverse and naughty about going in there and taking these people that we all kind of have a shared knowledge of and just making up so much about them, just giving them a very sort of giving them very ordinary human struggles that sort of take on bigger stakes because of whose mouths those struggles are coming out of. So that was a really big influence, and I had done that a couple of times. Once with Anna Nicole Smith, where basically I put a story about me and my mother in the mouth of Anna Nicole Smith, and then one about the Clintons, where I did similar things. And
was that also about you and your mom?
No, although she shows up in that too. But at a certain point, I started to kind of wonder if it was, if there's something kind of wrong and fundamentally narcissistic about taking these people and just sort of cramming my own stories down their throats. And so then came Isaac's Eye, which was, again, I was just going to take a play about Isaac Newton and write a story about myself and just call that character up on stage Isaac Newton. But there's in the research process, and this sort of kind of happened more, it started to happen more in Isaac's Eye than any of the other plays. where I would just start doing research, and I would read a biography about Newton, and I would just locate all of these factoids. Like I'd say, oh, well, that happened to Newton, that also happened to me, so I'm going to write about that. I would just go out and seek things that happened to both of us, and then construct a play around that. But then that play was written for a grant, and I had to submit a proposal to the Alfred P. Sloan Foundation that exists to kind of promote writing about science, and they looked at my story treatment, and they said, well, so much of this is made up, everybody's going to think that this is true, all the stuff you're saying about Isaac Newton is true. So they asked me to rewrite my proposal, and so I proposed this theatrical device where one of the actors would write everything that actually is true on the wall of the stage, and everything else the audience is told might be made up. So I really just put that in there in order to get the grant, because I knew they wouldn't give it to me if I didn't. But that got me kind of interested in this sort of problem of, well, is it right to be doing this? Is there something kind of wrong about misinforming the public about these people's lives? But at the same time, you kind of get, I would argue, kind of a richer, more three-dimensional view if you sort of start filling in gaps, because there's so much we can't actually know about Isaac Newton. So that's sort of, I don't know if that ultimately answered the question, but that sort of is my riff on my way of getting into this problem of what's true and what's not.
And with Disney, did you exercise the same kind of I mean, in Disney, the piece, I had to write it down because I've misquoted the name of the play 3 times already this afternoon to Lucas's face. So I'm going to actually read a public reading of the unproduced screenplay about the death of Walt Disney. It does have this, again, formal game that's going on, which is as though Walt Disney has written a screenplay about his own death, and so when things become uncomfortable, or when the synapses in his brain start to fire in a strange way, he keeps reading stage directions or camera directions. And in the same way that there is, in Isaac's Eye, there's a lot of, I don't know if it was unintentional or intentional, but it was incredibly funny to have this wry chalkboard voice, which was like another actor on stage. And so someone would say something absurd, like, and then he drank mercury. And someone would go up and be like, totally, he really did drink mercury. And then it would sort of sit there on the blackboard winking at you. And it was very funny. It was this sort of constantly present funny voice. And then in Walt Disney, you also have this sort of constantly funny idea that the camera is somehow in the room, or his idea of what the camera would be doing is somehow in the room. So did you have any of the same, did you use those formal techniques for similar reasons? Obviously not to get the grant, but
Yeah.
And how much of Disney is true?
I'm telling everybody that Disney is total fiction, although if you actually go through and count up the number of things that are said in that play that are documented somewhere, there are a lot, but I don't know that I trust what's been documented. Like I used a lot of biographies that people have discredited or at least suggested are full of lies. So I don't know if I want to take on the responsibility of saying that much in that play is true, but the camera directions are there. I don't know if I'm using it the same way that I used the chalkboard in Isaac's Eye, but the camera directions do. So Walt's reading this screenplay, but anytime something sort of uncomfortable starts to happen, or something that contradicts Walt, he'll just go skip ahead to the next thing, or he'll contradict people in the stage directions. One person will say, I'm really not sad about what you just did, and Walt will just read, Roy is sad. And so it's sort of a way of making active or making visible his process of kind of editing and reshaping the world around him. So Yeah, I guess I would say it's very different from how those factoids work in Newton. The thing with those facts written on the wall in the Isaac Newton play is that I think by the end you're just left with a whole wall of just facts, which I think kind of like you said, by themselves just completely aren't interesting, right? It's not particularly interesting just because it's true. There's not a story, it's just factoids. And it's the dance in between those facts that's actually more interesting, or how you play around with how you get from one factoid to another, how you speculate the connection between the facts.
Although I am actually someone who reads the trivia pages on IMDb with passionate interest. So John, you're in process now of having this kind of push me pull you relationship with things that people are actually saying. Do you plan at all to work what they are like? Is there a writing component here? Is there a way that you're editing it, which is itself dramaturgical?
Well, I think that what we're wrestling with in this case, we decided we wanted to take on the problem of this verbatim transcript. We really wanted, I mean, I'm always looking for a good problem, a good problematic situation to put myself in the middle of that I have to work my way out of. And I have to give myself those assignments in a serious way so that I can't just change the rules when it gets difficult, you know. So, you know, an easy example we talk about is with Gatsby. We did the whole book, and we made that the rule. We were going to do every single word of The Great Gatsby, and we couldn't cut a single word. So that became the rule there, and we're working with a similar rule here. And the problem with The Great Gatsby was, you know, it had to do with the form. You know, it was too long for theater. It was too much exposition and prose and not enough dialogue. Here, the problem has more to do with if we make ourselves say everything those Supreme Court justices and those lawyers said, it occasionally goes to a place where it gets a little bit dense for the layperson. But somehow we have a kind of blind faith in these real things somehow, and so our dramaturgy is more in our work really is more in the staging and how that becomes physically realized and how it finds a relationship with the stage, because we want to give ourselves that problem to deal with. It's fascinating to talk about this stuff too, because it was just making me think that we're always there's the temptation to deal with real facts and real people is always there in all kinds of forms like this. I often think about the beginning of the movie Fargo. You'll remember it says on the screen at the beginning of that movie, based on real events, and which is apparently not true at all. But it gives you a kind of sensation of the movie, because we want, we go to see movies and we go to see plays because we want to be lied to, and we want to be lied to really well, to the point where we start believing it. So to draw in from the real world that way, or in my case, to sort of force yourself to do everything as a kind of repetition of something that was absolutely real and true, while still making it feel like it's something reinvented, is this wonderful gray area that I think we both try to swim in, because it's a little bit thrilling and to know and not know at the same time what's true.
Well, it also does feel that, to me at least, the Supreme Court is also particularly ripe fruit to pluck, because I admit, when I was asking John what he was working on a year ago, and you said, I'm a total junkie for, listening to Supreme Court argument, I thought, all my hobbies are so not like that. But that I do have an image of them all sitting at this immensely tall desk wearing black graduation outfits, and I'm kind of crossing my fingers that maybe the British wigs will come back in or something like that. But it does all seem incredibly ridiculous, and that we have one silent Supreme Court justice who has finally spoken, and it made the news that he spoke.
Really?
He didn't speak?
He spoke to just make a dumb joke. That's all he said. He spoke to make fun of Yale Law School. Yeah, that's what he broke his silence for. Nobody quite heard it.
That's amazing. And so there's already this element. It's like going into a theater that already has its own rules and characters, and I mean, it is. He's like Rosencrantz or something. That there's this weird little silent guy on stage.
Although, to be fair, the case we're doing was from 1991,
before that
said justice was on the court.
Who are your favorite characters? Is there kind of or are they emerging as characters?
I think it's no surprise. I mean, Antonin Scalia is a great character because he's he's all about entertaining people, and he's although some would also say he's kind of a bully, but he's an entertaining character.
For the ERS diehards, is one person playing Scalia, or is it being kind of shared
It's a little
around?
bit shared around, and the way we're dealing with, because we have 3 actors instead of 9, they take on the justices themselves, kind of float between the people. You'll have a kind of secret little indication of who's talking that Ben Rubin, our projection designer, is going to be taking care of. But mostly you get to know the justices through their mannerisms and through their personalities. So yeah, you get a little bit of Susie playing Scalia.
That I was hoping that Susie so called.
Ben, Mike, and Ben. Yeah.
Oh my God. So when you, and this is something that Lucas said that I want to also ask you about, is that when you take other people's stories, in the one of the other speakers who's going to be with us, Darren Strauss, who's also played, who is Elijah at the table at the moment, has a wonderful, what is the little doodad in the beginning? Is that the epigraph? Thank you. In the epigraph of The Real McCoy, which is one of his sort of very playful riffs on a historical figure, he says, we only tell the truth. I'm horribly paraphrasing, but there's only one time when we tell the truth, and it's when we talk about other people. And I was wondering there's only one time when we describe ourselves accurately, and it's when we talk about other people. And so, Lucas, you were saying that there is, certainly watching Isaac's Eye, which was very much about someone coming to grips with how selfish can I be as a person who's making things. I did, in my secret heart, have suspicions that maybe you were grappling with those issues. But what in Disney do you think is reflective of you in talking about this? And then I will also ask that invasive and personal question of John.
Well, I think in my characterization of Disney, you could very easily see a theater artist who wants to dictate how everything is said, what the lighting looks like, what the set does, there's that kind of micromanagement of the world. I was always really interested in, among other people, Arnold Aronson has written about the total theatrical environment of Disney and how Disney is this extraordinary, meticulously choreographed theater project, and that vision of the theater always appealed to me, just as Richard Foreman's vision of the theater always appealed to me. So I always wanted to be a kind of a Richard Foreman type figure, and you can even see in the way that we staged the Disney play when you see it. Disney's up there, and I remember in one of the design meetings I said, Disney really needs one of those little slider panels like Richard Foreman has, because Richard Foreman's this theater artist who always sits in the audience during his shows and has a little panel that he uses to control the audio and adjust the volumes of different speakers. And that sort of kind of godlike micromanagement of the world is something that I think I'm...
And his own voice booming throughout the show.
Yeah, totally.
End of play.
I think that is an aspect of myself that I'm exploring in the Disney play, in the ways in which that attempt to try to have total control can backfire. There's a great quote from Walt: "You can't just let nature run wild." And I think there's some part of me that does not like the idea of nature running wild.
Whenever I make a show with my company, and I'm always starting out with a group of people who I know and trust, and who I, have already shared a lot with, spent a lot of time with, socialized with. These are my closest friends. So, in one sense, whatever we do is a kind of history of our last year or so together. So the shows, sometimes to a fault, are loaded with our own personal experiences, and sometimes in a very coded way, and sometimes not so much. But also, we make our shows by doing research. These are the things we want to know about. We try to become students, in a way, of something that we choose to take on. So we're trying to erase ourselves completely in doing that, because we don't want to come at what we're doing like we're experts. We want to come at what we're doing as students. But of course, this is a way of being the most personal about it. This is sort of method that I'm talking about in a way. I mean, if you look at, I think that when you spend as much time with your material as we do, it just becomes very personal, period. Sometimes they start out with personal obsessions. I mean, this piece, Arguendo, started out as a personal obsession of mine, and it was something that I never imagined I would get into my, theater practice, this, interest in constitutional law, even though it partly arose from a problem I was having in my theater practice with copyright.
For those of you who don't know, the production of GATS was the great foot of copyright tried to trample it for several years until victoriously nature ran wild.
Right. We just waited it out, really.
That's true.
So it's an interesting question, because I'm always trying to make my work as personal as it can possibly be, but I'm trying to do that by just erasing my own memory as best I can, and trying to learn something completely new, and trying not to pretend to know myself that well. And then I figure the part of me that will come out in the work will be the most honest. We're really sort of taking that quote to heart, and trying not to say anything about ourselves so that we can say something honest about ourselves.
And you almost always work on several projects at a time. You, I know, have already moved on to several new things. How is this sort of playing with the real world, playing with real facts, playing with real voices in particular? Has it changed sort of the things that you work on now? I know that Lucas, your most recent piece, Death Tax, is not at all based on a historical figure. It is a brand new human from your brain, amazingly. And I was wondering if there are things that it's difficult, obviously, to pull back and look at your own stuff, but do you see anything in your own practice and in your own product that is reflective of this sort of interest in the real thing?
I think I've embraced research a lot more, where I think prior to these famous people plays that I write, I did very, very little research, and now I think I just finished doing a project in the joint stock method. Mark Wayne Davey from NYU grad acting commissioned me to write a play in a method that Carol Churchill used to develop a lot of her plays, where the actors would be given a research topic and they would go out and they would bring back to the playwright tons of research, tons of interviews, and you just have to sort of sift through it and go off and make a play. But I find myself sort of using a similar process for all of the plays that I've written since I started writing famous people plays. I think before that I was a little scared that the research would end up would turn the play into a kind of book report. And I think I just sort of figured out a way to research.
Yeah. And John?
Well, we've, at various times throughout the 22 or so years we've been making shows together, we've gone to some extremes in terms of using found material. I think in a way I've always trusted that, just because it found material, whether it's wherever you find it, if you find it in a novel, or if you find it, in a random clip on YouTube, or there wasn't a YouTube when we started doing that, but we were already in that mindset. That kind of text has a way of refusing to be neat. It refuses to be. Sometimes it refuses to be dramatic in the way you want it to be, and it challenges you, and it sort of stands in opposition to all of our desires as theater makers to put something together that works, So I guess I've always believed in that somehow, because it creates a collision, It creates a collision between neatness and structure and something from the world. Lately, I am interested in. Working on this project has made me more interested in sort of testing what can work dramatically. Somebody is trying to convince me to do a play that's based on the congressional debates around the 14th Amendment, which is very exciting to me.
Voting rights.
Well, the 14th Amendment is a sort of mini constitution. It's got everything in it about citizenship, that's where we get equal protection and due process and all these concepts that are so important to the law and to our whole society. So, I get excited about doing more research. It's the same thing. Research is, I don't know, I think doing these kinds of plays means, like I say, you get to be a student again. You get to go dig into these things and learn something, and not so much for the sake of teaching something to your audience. It isn't about that. There's a kind of joy in diving into these real subjects because there's so much there.
Well, and it is supposed to be a recipe for keeping a relationship alive, to do a new thing, to learn a new thing. And I think that a lot of times in these pieces, I know that I saw gaps a couple of times, which is I think you have a day and a half of my life. And part of the endorphin rush was realizing that I knew a thing that I didn't know before I went in, and that there's actually, I think there's really a hormonal surge that you get when you learn a thing. And then my last question for you is specifically as theater makers and as people who make things that get embodied on stage, is that this kind of stuff also has very specific requirements of its actors. And Lucas, beforehand you were talking a little bit about the kind of people who make the work sing in a way that you find interesting. So I was wondering if you could sort of talk about, are you discovering as you do all of these projects, what is a sort of a Lucas Knapp actor?
Well, a lot of my texts are rhythmically tricky to kind of get out of your mouth. I'm very influenced by people like Gertrude Stein. I like repetition, and I have just found that the plays work best when I work with really, really technical actors who just sort of can go in there, initially not worry so much about the emotional life of the character, just trust that will follow if they can just sort of hit these really almost musical marks in the text. And I mean, even for the most accomplished actors, it can be incredibly uncomfortable. They feel almost like robots. I remember one group of actors saying, "We feel like we're Lucas's puppets," but without fail, there comes a point where something else kind of fills in that space that would otherwise make you a total robot. But yeah, just sort of I mean, people who almost treat the work of making a play like an athlete, and they sort of train for it. I mean, Larry Pine would come in every day, an hour or two before rehearsal, and just run lines, because it's just such a technically challenging piece, and that's sort of what it takes to pull off the work.
Same question. Well, I think ideally, I mean, I hate to limit it at all, because I have so many different kinds of actors that work for me, and I think my work is partly defined by the fact that I'm willing to have so many different kinds of actors right there together. Some who are, you know, all about just slapstick and bits, you know, and making the bit work, you know, and some who are just deeply serious about the psychology of their characters. But I guess where they all come together, and what's most important for me, is that I need actors who are curious, who really are open and curious and want to dive into whatever we're doing with that kind of curiosity about it, because that's how they're going to find their details. You know, that's how they're going to find their own rich world to live in inside of the play. So curiosity, but also playfulness. You know, Susie Sokol is the actor who's worked with me the most, and she's been in everything that I've done. And Susie is ideal in some ways that way, although there can only be one of her in the show. But she's incredibly curious. She's obsessive about researching. You know, she played a matador in the Select that we did recently in the workshop, and that, you know, she devoured that topic and learned everything she could possibly learn. And yet she's a petite woman playing a Spanish matador, and there's something a little bit absurd often about her relationship to her roles, and she's aware of that, and she's playful with it, and completely serious and dedicated at the same time. So that's a good example of a kind of actor that works well in one of my shows.
Kind of the ERS creature. Yeah.
She is.
She is. I wondered if anybody had any questions for John.
Yeah, I actually had a question about Larry Pine. Whose idea was it to cast him, and has his performance shown you or taught you anything about the piece that you've written?
Sarah Benson and I, way back in the fall, just started generating lists and lists of names, and Larry's was the name that just kept on coming up the most. And so we finally just decided, okay, let's just ask him. And he read the script in one evening and almost immediately committed to doing the role. We were surprised actually by how much he ended up looking like Walt. We did not pick him because he had any resemblance to Walt. We didn't think he did. In fact, we were sort of being stubborn about that. We were like, we don't want anybody who looks like Walt. It's more interesting if we sort of I like it when the person who walks out does not look anything like the person they're supposed to play. It just sort of makes you sort of think that, okay, all bets are off in terms of what we're going to see about this person. So Larry, before we knew it, had grown a mustache. And we're like, okay, well, we'll just tell him to shave it off, or he's going to go film House of Cards. Well, they'll make him shave it off, so we'll get rid of the mustache. But what ended up happening, there was a surprise. Like, I've always talked about the play as being a play in which an actor comes out and reads this screenplay to you, and he sort of takes on the character of Walt Disney. And I would say in this production, it really feels more like Walt Disney comes out on the stage and starts reading the script. And it works. You know, and that, I mean, off the top of my head, that was the first thing I learned about it, is that it really could be Walt coming out and reading the script to you.
So did you add that opening line then for this performance?
No.
That was always there?
So the opening line, or the sort of first official line of the play is, I'm Walt Disney, this is a screenplay I wrote, it's about me. That's always been there, but it works differently if the person clearly doesn't look like Walt Disney. It's actually a joke.
Right.
And now it's sort of like, yeah, that is Walt Disney. So that's a big shift that happened in terms of the play and kind of how it works.
I always think that's a beautiful thing about live theater, and especially live theater in smaller venues, where you can't avoid the fact that it's an actor playing a role, you know, and so that's always happening on some level. That it's you can never convince an audience deeply that these are not actors, that they're real people, and you know, film has that over us in a way because there's something so unquestionable about photography. But we don't have that, but I love that because every situation, in a way, every actor, you're watching them become the character in front of you. There's too much evidence that they're not actually the character they're playing, no matter what, even if they do look a lot like them. I mean, you know, even if you had deliberately cast a perfect Walt Disney lookalike, we all know that he's dead, you know? And so it's a lie, and it's a wonderful lie to come out and start that way. But then then you start enjoying what is so uniquely theatrical, which is the actor becoming the character, the actor being haunted by the character.
We talked a lot about the plays being a seance.
Mm-hmm.
And I have this theory that all plays are secretly seances. You're bringing back something from the dead. And so definitely, at a certain point, if you've seen the play, starts to resemble a seance more and more. That came out of a similar thinking.
Yep, just creepily writing down things you're saying. 1 second.
Is
Using
there
it
a
in
journalist
class
up here
later.
somewhere?
No. I'm multitasking. This will be a feature tomorrow morning.
I have a question.
Yes, ma'am.
Since you take real people and, you know, ostensibly they have family members that are around, do you ever get any pushback from family members about how dare you take my grandfather's name and image and change this and put this in here and influence the way maybe people will see him now?
It hasn't happened yet. I have a lot of ethical debates with myself all the time. I like to think that I make the plays in such a way that nobody's going to really take this as biography. On the other hand, you do have Amadeus, which is a play that has convinced us that there really was a feud between Mozart and Salieri, and there wasn't. So I like to think that the form and the sort of blatant playfulness of my plays would make people never take them as fact. But I worry about that a lot. I mean, beyond just family members contacting me, there is something that feels wrong about changing the image or influencing the image of this person beyond what they may deserve. So it's something I think about a lot, and I don't have a good answer to that.
But you still forge ahead anyway.
I still forge ahead.
Well, because I was thinking, doesn't Disney just sue? I mean, he couldn't come out in a pair of Mickey Mouse ears, or else you guys would be, handcuffed by
that
B Squad or something.
Yeah, taking that Mickey image, but it does fall into the category of parody, and so we in theory should be allowed, but
Fair use is what
Right. Just stay in contact with two people at all times.
Yes.
We
Sure.
had
We won't lose
a
you.
crazy experience with that because we did a show about 7 years ago, that was another kind of recreation of a transcript, and this time it was of William F. Buckley's talk show, The Firing Line. We were researching Jack Kerouac, because Susie wanted to play Jack Kerouac, and we found a couple of appearances he'd made on television, and one of them we were particularly enthralled by was a program from 1968, where William F. Buckley, famous conservative, wanted to have some people on to talk about the hippies. And he had Ed Sanders from the Fugs, and he had Jack Kerouac, and he had an academic named Louis Jablonski. We did that show, and we had interesting run-ins in one way or another with each of those four people. Not Kerouac himself, he's not with us anymore, but there was some little bit of eyebrow raising from the estate, although that we were able to dodge that. Some friend of Louis Jablonski's got wind of it and said, well, maybe you should check with him about that, because at one point we have Jack Kerouac lying on the floor reaching up Louis Jablonski's pant leg, and that didn't actually happen on the show. That's Susie being playful. And we had Ed Sanders, who is a friend of a friend, just sent us a big thumbs up, said go for it, have a good time. And William F. Buckley came to see the show and surprised us. I was terrified, of course, and he watched it, and he was with this person was with me, he was asking a lot of questions, and finally when he left, I came up to him and I just said, oh, thank you so much for coming, I just want to play nice, you know. And of course, Ben Williams had been playing him and doing his level best in impersonating William F. Buckley on stage, and all Buckley said to me was, I said, well, we're very honored to have you here. Thank you for coming. He went, yes. He was terrific. Ran back to the dressing room and told me. So you never know. I mean, it's dangerous territory for sure. But of course, I think we enjoy that. You know, a little bit of that danger of messing with the truth sometimes means messing with the truth of real people. And
well, and that's a real frisson that we have. That the act of saying something out loud about a real person might be a crime. It gives a little bit of the old danger back to the theater. We can't be hauled off by vice squads anymore, but we can be hauled off by William F. Buckley. Anybody else have a question?
I have a question about similarities you found in Walt Disney and Isaac Newton and maybe some of the other characters. Surprising similarities.
I was actually recently thinking about one that did come up. If you ask anybody on the street, was Walt cryogenically frozen? I'd say probably 8 out of 10 people would say yes. Maybe 7 out of 10. I mean, which is to say, most people are under the impression, it seems, that Walt was cryogenically frozen. He wasn't. But it's interesting that myths sort of seem to sprout up around this guy. There are a bunch that I kind of discovered when researching him. My favorite one was that a very credible book said that Walt, when he found out that he was dying, had a film crew come in and film about 15 years worth of boardroom addresses, monthly boardroom addresses, and that after he died, the board would continue to gather and play these films, and you'd have like Walt saying, it's October 1971, you should be here with this project, and here with this project. And the book cited at least one board member saying this really happened. And then I researched it elsewhere, and there are board members who say, no, this never happened. But and so he just sort of seems to attract these myths. Newton is actually really similar. I talked to a science historian who said that every 50 or so years, who Newton is reevaluated, and there's some sort of somebody writes a biography of Newton that really just reflects the era more than it does the person Newton. And I thought that was really interesting. And he actually cited the different eras of Newton biographies and what that actually said about the time period, not the person. And so I kind of feel like Walt's might be a similar character. At least they seem to be sort of myth magnets.
I'm crushed that he wasn't frozen. He really wasn't frozen?
Yeah, he really wasn't.
I'm wondering which playwright or what theater company you'd like to produce the play about you after you're gone.
Oh, ERS. I think ERS actually.
Yeah, ERS would be good. I mean, if I have some good transcripts sitting around. think all the interviews that I'm doing over this past month I could collect. I mean, yeah, I'd be honored to have ERS or Richard Maxwell see his take on me. That'd be funny. He once told me I should play an Irish drug runner in a play. He goes, "Do you do an Irish accent?" I said, "No." He goes, "Oh."
Yeah,
I've certainly seen the Disney production, and I saw the work in progress of Arguendo in public, and they both have incredibly strong choreographic elements to them. In our production, Annie B. Parsons did the choreography, and in Arguendo there's all this movement. And I'm wondering, can you guys maybe just speculate about, is there an overlap between choreography and telling a story about real people, or why perhaps you chose that?
Well, I mean, I think that we use choreography sometimes in our shows in a defiant way. It's a way for just theatrical energy to take over and to trump any sensation of intellectual truth. So it's a kind of choreography on some level, whether it's just in coordinating the way everything moves, or if it's just outright dances in our work, is a way to kind of push back almost against that sense of realness and truth in a way. It's sort of there to be I sort of say it's there to be a reminder, but it doesn't really have such an explicit purpose. But I think it serves as a reminder that what you're seeing, the most important truth that you're witnessing, is the thing that is happening in front of you in that theater on that stage. That itself is a true thing. And that can be a true thing without referencing anything else other than just its own physical presence. And so choreography has always functioned that way for me. It's a way of getting down to something more elemental about live physical performance. So it's a way of undermining, in a way, some of that, that other truth.
Well, and in your piece also it means that you can go so much further in that direction, because you're going to be snapped back by this absurd explosion of just giddy movement, which means that the piece can actually go down a very strange and winding and sometimes dense corridor. You can't have a dense corridor. Because then you'll be dancing.
I know what you mean.
Yeah.
I mean, I would probably echo that. In my plays, it starts with the language already being very musical, and the reason why the language is musical is to sort of counteract that feeling of a bioplay. Because there were earlier versions of the Disney play that did not have the musical language, that felt like, okay, and here's a scene from this moment from his life, and here's a scene from this moment from his life. And I just didn't like it. I just said, this feels like a bioplay. So I smashed that up and made the language much more rhythmic, which sort of puts you in a different frame of mind. It makes you a little less logocentric as you're watching it, and the dance echoes that.
The choice behind that sort of anachronistic incorporation, I mean, is that a way of diverting from writing a bioplay, or something?
Yeah, yeah, I think so. I think it's tied into that. I mean, what you're watching at the top of the play is the even before Walt enters, these actors are here to do this reading. So you see on the desk or on the big table, the stuff the actors would have there. Amanda actually at one point goes off and brings in her purse or her bag. You have pencils, you have the kind of gross food that they often give you at the first read-throughs of plays. It's all that stuff, including the phones. So there are moments where we're just reminded, no, we're just in a room. Yeah, that's Walt Disney there, but we're in a room and we're reading this play, and these are all actors from today.
The choreographer for the piece, Annie B. Parsons, is very fond of quoting, I think it's from Chinese opera, this saying, we have a child play the gods so that we will not be accused of lying. And I always think that's one of the great things in watching these real, not real pieces, is that there is something about them that feels truthful without having to bother with telling the truth. Anybody else? Otherwise, I think we have to let them go frolic and make theater.
That's a great note to end on.
Thank